and I want to welcome you to the 60-minute webinar. Before I introduce our presenter for today, Terri Nelson, there are a few housekeeping items I want to share. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, you can ask questions via the chat feature in GoToWebinar. We will have time for questions at the end of our program. Today's webinar is being recorded. This webinar will be added to the SMITU library for future use, and you will receive a copy of the PowerPoint slides via email. There will be a brief survey at the conclusion of our program today. Please take a few moments to complete the survey and provide your feedback. We do use this feedback to make improvements for future sessions. Now let's begin our program. It's my pleasure to introduce Terri Nelson. Terri is Director of Value Analysis, Supply Chain Category Management for Mayo Clinic and leads the Clinical Quality Value Analysis team. Terri was also part of the SMI Medical Device Recall Initiative. Terri, I want to thank you for supporting SMI and for presenting this webinar today. And with that, I will turn things over to you. Terri, welcome.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for those of you on the phone. I appreciate having an opportunity to share with you the Mayo Clinic Value Analysis process. As Christine shared, my name is Terri Nelson. I'm the Director of Value Analysis at the Mayo Clinic, and that's for all campuses. I've been at Mayo for a little over 40 years as a staff nurse and in a variety of different roles. Within supply chain, we manage recalls, and within that, the work unit of value analysis was assigned this responsibility. The one thing good about that, well, there's multiple things good about it, not just one, but is having a clinical perspective when we receive recall notifications. It's very helpful having that view as you look at the different recalls you receive. So let me share a little bit about who Mayo Clinic is. This is a slide that simply shows you our system and the scope of the system. We're very proud to be rated as one of the best hospitals. But to give you an idea, we have over 60,000 employees, all that can be touched by a recall notification. And we operate in 22 different hospitals in 5 states. Our recall management program is that. It's just not a notification, it's a program that we manage, and we do it for all campuses of Mayo Clinic. So we have an individual that manages all of the processes, so it can be done in a standard way. This is a, sorry, I think I got it. I'm sorry, I got a slide that was out of scope here. So the scope of this presentation is to talk about recall. And the reason I put this in here is we have one policy. So as I shared, we do recall management for all campuses, but we operate under one policy, but we have 2 procedures. And for this presentation, my focus is going to be on the recall management procedure specific to product, medical devices, hazardous notices, or alert procedures. We do not do pharmaceuticals or medications. Those are handled by my colleagues in pharmacy, and they have a separate procedure. It follows a similar format as far as key points, but the individuals and groups that are alerted are different. This is what is a medical product recall. So this is how we define it, and we put it into 3 areas. We use a voluntary manufacturer recall, which is the majority of the recalls we get are from suppliers. I have to tell you, we operate that suppliers all have the potential to have a product recall. That no supplier wants a product recall, but they're going to manage it and make sure that our patients are safe by sending a notification and giving us actions to resolve that issue. So we don't think of these as negatives, we think of these as positive and a way to, again, safeguard our patients. So we appreciate it when the manufacturers send those notifications. We also have the FDA recall notifications, and they're different classes. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And we have a system we call our internal recall. This is when a product has failed to consistently be able to achieve what is the expected outcome with the product. And that means in operations. The product, we can't open it up or we can't do something with it. Many times this is shared with our quality office, and we do submit that this is a quality report, but we really want to work with the suppliers to resolve the issue first. We do very few internal recalls. There are exceptions to our processes, but when we can't make resolution into get a quality product back in and an effective product back in, sometimes we have to do this system. The recall management program has multiple components. The first is notification. That's when we receive a notification from the supplier of the FDA, our preferred route for notification is to receive that electronically. Now, we do get a fair number electronically from the supplier. We also get them internally. We've done a lot of education to our staff over the years about how if you receive a recall notice, you can scan it in and send it into our recall management mailbox, and we will then start to address the issue. We need a notification prior to doing any other action items. Included in that notification is product identification, so our process will actually identify the products that we've used. Here's my pitch to you guys who are suppliers on the call. If you can send us the product information in an electronic format and in an Excel spreadsheet, we can more efficiently pull our database together and look to make sure whether or not we have those products. When the item is sent in a PDF, that requires more manipulation on our part in order to be able to search our system effectively. The communication here with any recall management system is you've got to have a communication channel out there. You've got to be identifying internally who are your stakeholders and who have to receive the notification. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in the coming slides. So you get the notice, you identify your products, you communicate, but you need a response. You need to understand, did your staff get the recall notice? Did they do any action with it? Or did they do nothing at all? So we do ask for all recall notifications that we send out that our staff respond in some way. That doesn't mean that everybody has to respond, but we ask it by departments if they respond. Then once that happens, we have to do closure. Got the notice, we communicated, we got the response. Now we're going to close it out of the system. And then we're going to store the information in a database so that at any time we can look at that information. In the closure, we include the responses internally, any documentation that we received on it, any action items that we did. And we put this in this repository of information that's on a web-based tool that at any time our staff can go into and pull up a recall notice. They can search it by supplier, they can search it by product, and then they'll see all the information there, the steps that were done, who was involved in those steps, and what type of communication was sent. This whole process is managed by our recall management coordinator. So for all of the campus, we have one recall coordinator. That individual then manages the communication and the closure and the repository of information. We also have a backup individual for when that person is on vacation. If you have a structure in place that functions, then you're going to be able to do this successfully with not requiring a lot of additional FTEs. The other thing to think about with the recall management system is your tool itself. When we were looking at developing a tool, we've been doing recall management. I've been working with it since 2008, so a little over 10 years. At that time, there wasn't a tool that we felt was as robust as what we needed. And our colleagues in pharmacy had already looked at a system and was using something to track their recall notices. So instead of going external, we decided to build on what pharmacy had already started. So our tool is an internally developed item. There are many great suppliers out there that have systems to manage recalls. If you don't have your own recall system, I would suggest that you consider those. And what we found to be good practice is we periodically go out and look at what's in the marketplace for individuals or third parties that manage recalls. We just recently did that. We found that our own system, because we are so knitted together with internal communications, that was going to be more successful for us than if we were to outsource this process. But I think it's still good to look at that. You know, when you're doing that, looking at a system, think about how centralized the information is going to be. So we have a centralized recall database, as I shared. It's a web-based tool where any staff can go into it. In order to access the tool, they have to go through our internal firewall and use their employee identification sign-on information. The notifications and the communications and all the responses are tracked both in that web-based tool, but we also have another system that only the recall coordinator can see that will track response information and do follow-up communications if needed to the end users. We can keep various reports that we pull from our system, and then we can always have the employees check that. So these are kind of steps that we always look at to make sure we're following the process. When we receive a recall notification, and this is just a visual going over additional information, we look at where we're coming at, our sources. Then we do a search for our purchase history. Now, if it's a consumable, we go back 2 years in our item master and look at our purchase history related to that. If it's capital equipment, we go back 5 years. If it's something that may have a slow turnover, we might go over additionally. Then we also send a notification to individuals. Now, this is how we've identified who's going to receive the notification. If an employee actually purchased the product and their name or identification is on the purchase history, they will receive a notification that they may have purchased a product that is now being recalled. If it's a department, so if the product is something that's used in the cath labs, we have a distribution list that we've developed that has all of the cath lab individuals listed on that. Now that took a little work to do. We didn't want to just send it out to anybody who was an employee in the cath lab. We actually went to the different departments. So we went to surgery, we went to the cath lab, we went to all of our areas, clinical areas, and said, we have a system for recall notification. Who in your area should receive that list? For the cath lab, they identified their inventory clerks. For surgery, they had another list of individuals. In addition, they had a champion or two that they wanted also included on the notifications. We wanted to make sure that we communicated to all of the right individuals involved, but we didn't over-communicate. Our concern there was getting email fatigue. You see so many notifications that we were apprehensive that an employee may say, well, somebody else is going to address that. I don't have to do that. So we look at that DL. We've developed these individual DL lists that now are integrated into our notification system. And those lists we try to review annually. Now, the only reason I say try is we have lots of lists. And so our recall coordinator alternates. So she may do, of 100 distribution lists, she may do 50 in 1 year, and the next year she'll do the next 50. Because we want to make sure that the process is manageable and as current as possible. This is just an example of a recall notification that we send via email. And there's just some key things that we like to make sure that's included. This is actually a template. Based on the type of recall notification we receive, whether it's through the supplier, whether it's through the FDA and it's class 1, 2, or 3, or if it's something internally, we would identify the type of recall in the subject line. You are not able to see that subject line here, but that would say recall, what it is, and the type. Then we actually tell them we've highlighted the areas that are key for them to look at. We encourage them that they have to read the recall notice. As a supplier, you put tons of great information into that notice, and that's providing direction to the clinical area on what to do. So it's important that they review that. We don't interpret the suppliers, we direct them to that, and the content information that says if you have questions, here's who you can respond to. As you can see here then, as I mentioned before, right in the center, you'll notice it says the product number, we identified lot and serial, and then we have the purchase history, and these are by campuses. So we look to see were all of the campuses involved, or was it just a select number of them? The importance of this is if we need to bring in a substitute product and all the campuses are involved, we're going to start in supply chain identifying what that sub-product is and what locations they need to go to and how we'll set up that ordering information. If it's only a few, then our scope is changed accordingly. We also want our colleagues to know that you may not have an effective product, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking on your shelves just in case somebody brought something in through unofficial channels. We do a lot of times educating our staff about not accepting products at no charge, not accepting products without a purchase order, because we run our recall notifications from a purchase order, and that we want to keep all of our patients safe, and that will help us to do that. Then, as I mentioned, our end users are requested to respond. Now, again, that communication letter that goes out by the distribution list that I referred to, those individuals have already been educated and know I need to respond. So if I'm in the cath lab and 4 of us get the recall notice, we have agreed that Mary this week is going to respond to the recall. However that practice set is set up, we let them drive that. We're driving the communication, and we're going to ask them to respond. And I think that's important clarification within supply chain as a role in communicating and collecting information on a recall notice. But the end users the clinical staff need to review the notification and take the appropriate action. When they come into the system, they'll sign in with their ID information that's unique to the organization, and then they'll put that they're responding to the notice and which notice it is. In that section where it says potential area or area, they will select who they're responding to. That will bring down an additional drop-down box where they can put in their information. Now, at this time, it's free text, but with like any program, we've been talking about, should we give them some more prompters, such as had product returned to supplier, had product no currently on the shelf, something along that line. So then those become fields that we can search on in the future. Now, I've talked a lot about recalls that come in through the system, but one of the things is just this last year, we re-looked at our system to make sure that we were doing everything we could to keep our patients safe and our employees educated. We share a lot of information with staff, but when you're dealing with a large organization, you may miss somebody. So we developed a recall management system that involves patient or employee safety. So we looked at all of the different recall notices that we received, and then it started to look at, we've received a few of them that we had to do more communication to patients that might be external to the acute care. So their patients were taken care of, but they're no longer an inpatient population. A lot of times when we look at recalls, we're looking at that population within the hospital walls. Well, what if we're using a product that we're managing a patient external, and that means at home or in a clinic setting? So those recall notices, again, that's why it's nice when they come to somebody with a clinical background, because I look at all the recall notices or one of my team members, and then we start to vet through that. Is this a recall notification that maybe needs to be reviewed by what we now call our medical product device recall response team? This is an executive team that has come together. It's made of our clinical leadership, administrative leaders, and safety officers. And we take those notifications and share with them when appropriate. This involves a patient, and it's actually potential harm to a patient. How would you like us to react with this? That team then is responsible to do an assessment and determine if they want to activate the recall response team. Now, that team is made of clinical and administrative leaders across the organization or in specific categories. So let me just use an example. We had an example with the hemosticks recently where patients were testing their blood in an outpatient area, and they were receiving some products that had been affected by a recall notification. And we needed to communicate to those patients. So in supply chain, all I can do is find a purchase history of did we buy the product. I can't tell you what patients are using the product and what other additional items or safety measures should that patient take. So in that case, we identified who were the users. We pulled together the executive group. We also talked with our legal and risk management, and public affairs was part of it. Subject matter experts. We pulled in, as you can see, a variety of individuals that may be affected by that recall notice or anything else related to that. And we started to review the recall notice and talking with the suppliers about what were our responsibilities for communication. We wanted to do this communication for the whole organization. So we looked at all the campuses that were impacted. We were looking at all the different areas. We were pulling our data to see where those patients were and information. And then we were crafting a communication that would go out to the patients and out to the physicians or the clinical group. So we needed to make sure our clinical staff were aware we received a notice, and we were going to be communicating this for patients, and you have the potential to get some calls from patients. And then developing a script so we were consistent in our messaging. And through that episode, we decided that we needed to regularly have a group, and it had to have clinical leadership involved in that. That group then is responsible, as I shared, to develop all the guidance for the management of the patient, and some of these products may impact an employee as well. They will develop and execute what we call a recall management plan. So it's more than just communicating it. It's actually identifying what actions you as a practice area may need to take, what communications you should take to your patients who may be involved. Now, the reason why we wanted to centralize that is we really strongly believe it's one Mayo Clinic with multiple doors. So if you're in Rochester or Arizona or Mankato, Minnesota, and you have the same potentially to be impacted by this notice, you should get the same level of communication and response. That's great to our patients. We felt very committed, but we also wanted to make sure our employees knew what to do. I got a recall notice. It looks like I need to communicate to patients. How do I do that, and how do I do that effectively? These documents and the whole recall plan is again submitted to our web-based tool so that anytime we can pull out that information and look at what actions were completed. That includes the summary document as well. Since we activated this, we have done 2 of these response teams. One of them was a recall notice that was more in question. It really wasn't a product recall, it was product pause. It was a product that may have a questionable impact, but the clinical staff wasn't quite sure if they needed to stop using the product or if they just needed to follow up with the supplier more. But they were uncomfortable, and they knew we had started this response team. So they used this as an avenue to get the right members of the clinical practice together and come up with an action plan, and then decide, that group right now decided they were going to pause with the product. They're getting more information, and they're going to use this channel, if appropriate, to communicate to patients. But they felt like now they could get to all of their colleagues and everybody was getting a consistent message. We take it very important. It's a serious job to make sure that our patients stay safe, and we really try to do that as effectively as we possibly can. We do not react. That second bullet is really important. We don't react to a recall notice until we receive the notification with the details. We have a lot of employees, Mayo employees, over 60,000 individuals. At any time, every one of them could get a recall notice or get an article that says, hey, this product is going to be pulled. Until we receive the official notification, either from the supplier or from the FDA, we do not pull that product or send out any communication. And the reason is we want to avoid confusion. We want to have official documentations. We want them to follow our official process and communicate it through our channels that we've already established so that we can, again, make sure that that safety is maintained at all times. This tool, we also communicate our recall coordinator's number. This is her internal number at any time if you have a question. And we have had FDA site visits who have occurred at different campuses. This is the number that they are instructed to call, and we can provide them with all the information on how we managed a recall. We also encourage staff that if they receive a paper notice, if they don't want to send it to us electronically, they can send us via an email or via our interclinic mail system and send the official notice there. We ask them not to respond to the notices until we have completed putting them in the system, again, to avoid any potential confusion or with the process that we have in place. Now, I went over that fairly quickly, Christine, but I give time for questions if people have questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Terri. Thank you. That was great, great information. We do have a couple questions, and if anyone in the audience, participants have additional questions, you can use the submit your question feature in GoToMeeting. Terri, obviously Mayo Clinic is the gold standard for medical device recalls. I mean, obviously you're a huge organization. If there is an organization that's starting from ground zero, what are the first 2 to 3 steps to get started, would you say?
I would think they need to identify who is going to manage recalls. We, as I said, because supply chain is ordering products, it was determined that supply chain management would be the start for recall notification. Sometimes safety and risk will do that information, but for us it was the department, and the department was going to be within supply chain. So identifying who's going to capture the information. And then based on the size of your organization and the resources, do you want to develop your own internal system, or do you want to have an external system, a third party, help you with that? whichever way you do, you are going to have to, I strongly recommend you have to have a recall coordinator. You have to have somebody that's going to manage those step processes. You can call that individual anything you want or incorporate it in another role that you have within your organization. And then you have to have leadership oversight. So we have a recall coordinator, and as far as leadership oversight, it would be myself, because my role is to make sure when they get a notice that we are looked at it from a perspective of the whole organization. And that's just probably good practice to make sure that you have that relationship there. But to get started, understand your practice, understand where it's going, and what tools you need to have.
Great, thank you. So another question, how does the UDI fit into medical device recall process?
So we do put for specific products. We do not track lot and serial numbers on all our products within our item master or ordering history, but we do for all implants. So again, if there's a recall notification that comes in and there's a unique product identifier as part of that, it's already captured in the system when it was used in the patient. And the recall notice goes to those individuals who manage and track that process. And then they follow up with the action steps as identified through the recall. So for those products that are required, they're captured. In the future, and we're working on this a lot, for all of our clinical preference items, not just an implanted product, we'd like to make sure we track by lot or serial numbers. So we're working on a system to make sure that's available to us that would make it much more efficient for us to be able to identify when we've received a notice that is very specific to a lot number or certain serial numbers that we can find them quickly. But we only have it right now for our medical devices that are implantable.
Okay. SMI recently had a medical device recall initiative, which I know you were part of, and the team talked about possibly having a standardized communication system. So, for instance, if, let's say on a Monday, a particular product was recalled, there would be an automated communication out, and so a surgeon wouldn't necessarily use that product if they were going into the operating room on a Tuesday, let's say, something that was automated. What do you think about that? How do you feel about that?
We do have in particular in surgeries, we do have a tool that we use. It's not linked up with our recall system, but it is a way of flagging products within that tool to identify, hey, there's been a recall and this may be a potential risk here for a product. I think that's a good step as long as you follow the whole process. So when we brought this in, my caution was, will staff become dependent on only seeing a notification on a screen prior to a surgical procedure happening in the example you used, Christine, where they really need to understand all the products they're managing or the products in this category, and they have to look at their shelves. Because even though the screen may say that product has the potential, you still have to look at it. And so I think having more references is good, but that doesn't mean that's the only tool you have and that you rely on that solely. So they have to be netted together.
Okay. One more question, and again, any of the participants that have a question can submit a question to Terri using the Submit Your Question feature. Have you ever thought of, or do you have a scorecard to measure the average length of time it takes to get a recall product out of your system? And then do you then work on ways to sort of shorten the length of time? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that is a great question. And thank you for asking it, because it is something that we've had on our scorecard for a long time, is we track specifically the risk. So we were looking at recall notifications and the risk involved, and we identified the risk was from the time we received the notice till we closed that response, because during that time is when you could have a defective product used on a patient. So we do track, and we track it a couple ways. We have a database that we put this information in that's part of our recall management system, and it notes in there the date that we received the recall, either electronically or in a paper form, and the date that it was actually on the notification itself to see how much difference there is there. And then we track it from the time we send it out to the end users to the time they respond, and we can close it. We have an expectation for any class 1 that we get a response within 24 hours. Now, the full action of the response doesn't have to be taken there, but we need to know within 24 hours, did you receive the product or do you have the product? And what actions are you going to be working on? They don't have to be completed. And we track that, and then we also track it for the class 2s and 3s. We group them in 3 to 5 days is our expectation. We measure ourselves, though, as a cumulative. So we look at all recall notifications, what's our average length of time to close that? And we average about 4 days for all of them. But then we can break it down by class, and we can break it down by supplier. The supplier information is information then we take and we put on our supplier scorecards. So when we do business reviews with some of our key suppliers, we always pull recall information. Now, we don't pull it as a negative. We really are pulling it, and we would pull the type of recall, and we ask them to also include the amount of time for closure, because that tells us how a supplier is communicating it effectively, that we can take care of it and close it in a timely manner. So we do put that on the supplier scorecard as well. So 2 ways of tracking it, both our amount of risk that goes on our department scorecard, and then we provide that information back to the suppliers on their scorecard.
Okay, that's great. Some other questions. So how are decisions made to act on a recall, and who makes them?
For most of the majority of the recalls that we get, the actions are driven by what the notification says. So if we receive a notification that says all product needs to be removed, that's communicated and all areas are asked to remove it. Now, we've done this a fair amount of time, so our system works very well. The first thing is, if it's an inventory item, we immediately talk to our inventory staff, our logistics staff, prior to actually sending out the communication to our internal staff. The reason we do that is if this is an internal item that's used at a lot of locations and all the products are being asked to be pulled, we want to make sure we have a replacement for that product so that we don't have a disruption in patient care, right? So we ask our logistics staff to immediately start looking at, hey, lot serial on this product. Do we have any out there? What's it look like for inventory? Because we're going to release this recall and staff are going to be calling you for replacement product. Once we determine, do we have products available? We don't wait for it. We just want to get a handle. We start placing orders. Then we release it to the rest of the staff with instructions on following the instructions that the supplier or the FDA have stated. And then we also add there is if we're going to return the product, they can return the product to their appropriate inventory location. Is usually included in the template as well. But the actions have to be specific to the supplier, has to be clear on that. If the supplier's notification doesn't appear clear to us, just so you know, we will call the supplier and say, we got the notice, we're a little confused by this and that. Can you give us some more supporting documentation or more information on that? That's again why it's a clinical person and a process person, that recall coordinator, looking at it together. So again, either myself or one of my colleagues review all of them to say, okay, yep, they got direction, yep, that's where it's going to go, or I think we need to call them again.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And we have a number of other questions, Terri. So someone asked, is using predictive analytics for recall management on your horizon?
Yeah. It's a good question, right? So what are you predicting? It's really I don't know how it fits within recalls. When I think of predictive analytics, I think of the prediction of an event happening again. So there's multiple factors related to that more than just a supplier. If we took recalls and just looked at back orders or product availability, we are trying to incorporate more in predictive analytics within that tool, because we want to understand where a supplier is getting, where they're getting their products from, what are their sources for their secondary supplier, and then is there a risk for us with that product, and how do we predict that risk and then manage through that risk? We do that more with product back orders and substitutions, which is also part of our role, but is not a recall. And we keep those separate. I just want to be real clear. Recalls, there's actually a process and notifications, very structured, that we're following. Within back orders, there may be a blimp. We may be impacted by it. We may not. We put on different parameters, and we use more prediction tools within that we're developing. That's a whole nother presentation there, Christine.
I know. It really is. And actually, someone asked how you manage equipment recalls, Terry. I don't know if you
Great.
want to do that
Yep.
or.
We do. We do. We have a team, our biomed organization. They, you know, when you get a piece of equipment, it can go to multiple individuals that may be involved with that. So over the last, we started probably 6 years ago that we started working with their team to identify what's the best way to manage it. Because equipment, we might have a purchase order that goes back, but there might be other information about that product, lot, serial, product identification, repairs, equipment, quality checks that they've done. And that's housed all in biomed, and it's in a different data repository. So working through them, they have identified 2 key points. They have identified who they want to be communicated to. We send the notification to them, and they track it through their whole system, and they then respond to the notice. If it is a piece of equipment where we need you to switch out a plug, and making it really simple, or contact us with what you need, they will take care of doing all of that, and the clinical staff would not have to do that. And then biomed comes back and sends their response of what the action they did and completes it in our response tool.
Okay. A few more questions, Terry, and it looks like we have time. We're doing good on time. So someone asked, why do you only look at the last 2 years of purchases for consumables? How did you come to that method?
That's a good question. Because we think if people are buying products for longer than 2 years, they probably are hoarding products, or they're not following their effective management of product, right? So consumable really shouldn't have it on your shelf. We feel you should not have it on the shelf longer for 2 years. Unless it's put on a shelf that nobody knows, unofficial inventory type of locations would happen. We have found that we really feel strongly that we probably are able to capture all the product history of effective products. Now, that being said, so if we get a notification from a recall that the product was manufactured in 2016, we will go back that far to see if it was there, if we purchased it in 2016. And then we're going to hope it's not on the shelf, but we will send out a notice. But unless there's a date range specific to the recall notice on there, we will always use a standard 2 years.
Okay. On an annual basis, how many recalls do you manage? Do you have a sense of how many?
Yeah, we do keep that tool. You know, this has been a banger year. Why, I'm not sure I can speculate, but we average between 450 to 500 recall notices. We do, now, we get any notice that comes to us that's tracked, and then the amount of times we have affected product may vary. So I'm just talking, we receive that many notifications and do some type of action step with them.
Okay. There were a number of questions, Terry, around credits and device credits. Can you talk a little bit about your process for that?
Really, probably not, because we have, so if it's an implant, we do have a credit system and a tracking system, and it's our implant group, registry group, there's a whole structure around that they do, that they've developed. And so the notice would go through, it go to this group, and then they track it differently. So I'm really not the expert on that.
Okay. What about a way to track lot numbers? Do you have a way to do that?
We do not yet. We've been talking a lot about it.
Okay.
But if anyone has really great ideas, please send them my way, because I ask a lot of people about it.
Okay. We have one more question, and then we can give people some time back in their day. This question says, what happens if the site/account does not have a backup product to use? How does it, how does it risk action?
Yeah, and that's a good question too. That's why looking at managing a recall from a broader perspective, you know, I'm referring to an enterprise because that's a term we use internally to refer to all of Mayo Clinic. Having that perspective helps us to identify this is going to be a campus that had a lot of effective products, and we need to get them the sub-products. And so we do share products within our organization. And we've run into this several times when it came to product back orders, where we've actually looked at inventory, did conservation, and were able to cover other campuses internally. We do the same thing with recalls. Again, looking at what the sub's been identified. We talk with, does that campus already have that product in? Doesn't it? Who else can help them in making sure they get that? And when I say we do that, it's not just for the Midwest, because that's where many of the campuses are, but Arizona and Florida, it's for the entire organization. We look at that. That's why when you're looking at a system too, you want to make sure that you can get a perspective from your entire organization, so you can manage that recall, to, no harm to a patient, but you also don't want to have a disruption in their care. So looking at the alternatives and sharing them.
And just one more question. Does your recall coordinator have a clinical background? I thought that was a good question. Yeah,
it's a great question. She does not. She has an administrative background or business background, but she does not have a clinical background. But she sets, another good idea, my staff is all on campus, and they all sit together in a location, and their offices are all together, and so is the recall coordinator. And that was very strategic for us to put that individual there, so if there was a clinical question she could just, she just hollers over the barrier to them, and they are able to address it. And can talk about scope and help her. So I don't know I think you need to have someone who understands systems, processes, detailed oriented, good relationship skills, able to meet and educate other individuals. But if you put them with your other clinical staff and supply chain, then they don't need to have a clinical background.
Okay. Well, we had some great questions, and Terri, this was a great presentation. I thank you again for supporting SMI. I want to remind everyone that at the conclusion, when we end, there'll be an automated survey, and please take the time to answer those questions so that Terri and I can know your feedback. And we will be sending out Terri's PowerPoint presentation to all attendees. Terri, thank you so much, and I thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Bye.